Hello, I'm William Brackney, the director of the Acadia University Center for Anabaptist and Baptist Studies. We are pleased to invite you to enjoy the 2015 George Rawlyk Memorial Lectures that were held here on our campus last fall. Our special lecturer is indeed a very well-known scholar of religion in general, church history, and also becoming much better known in North America as her work circulates here. Dr. Andrea Struben was educated at the Church University in Berlin, where she received her doctorate and also her habilitation in Heidelberg University in Germany. She is a specialist in the area of 20th century religion, Baptist studies, and also of the course of women in religious work and higher education. She is currently the Dean of Humanities and Studies at Karl von Ossietzky University in Oldenburg, where she also holds a chair in church history. In this first lecture, Dr. Struben will address the topic of Baptist and National Socialism, a unique topic for us. We hope you will enjoy her first lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm really ashamed about this. I'm honored by the invitation of ACBES, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. For me, it's the first day in Canada, and I'm really delighted by your wonderful country, Nova Scotia, and I hopefully come back again. I'm a Baptist, but I can explain it. This slightly modified bon mot of Woody Allen shows the situation of the so-called free churches in Germany. Whoever does not belong to one of the major churches in Germany, the Roman Catholic or the Protestant Church, is even today still in need of explanation. The two churches, each representing a third of the German population, are predominant in the social, public and cultural memory, and as a result, smaller denominations or minority churches have to justify their existence until today. This is also true for the massive religious pluralization that started in the 1970s in German society. To taper this into perspective in view of my own personal Baptist background, my great-grandmother was imprisoned as a child because her mother had joined the Baptists. In my contribution, I'm going to refer to the largest one of the so-called classical free churches in Germany, the Baptists. Let me start with quite a famous quote. "We Baptists are convinced that the Church of Christ can never be a tool for nationalistic endeavors without losing her power and denying her mission to the world. That any sort of dependency on the state which restricts her freedom to exercise love in the world represents a real danger for the Church and reduces her opportunities to carry the gospel to the ends of the world." Quote end. This clear statement on the dangers of nationalism dates from the report of the First Commission of the Baptist World Alliance on Nationalism of 1934. It was expressed by Nils Johan Nordström, the Swedish Vice President, at the 5th Conference of the Baptist World Alliance in Berlin, in the former capital of the Third Reich. As we turn to the history of the German Baptists under the Third Reich, let us be led by the question how the congregations sought to retain their identity as free churches in the face of a totalitarian state, which made a claim to ideological control over every area of social life. The history of the German Baptists, which first began in the 19th century, cannot be understood without taking note of the particular church historical and political context of Germany. The decisions of the confessional era, which did not tolerate two or more religions in a particular area because this would endanger the internal peace of mind and external political peace, still left their mark in spite of the laws of tolerance. The sovereign had had the right since 1648 to determine the religion of his subjects. This territorial principle, together with the idea of unity of the faith, which was enforced by state power, remained the dominant paradigm in Germany and impeded the development of religious pluralism. To this day, the two main churches, which both enjoy state privileges, dominate the German society. This fact rests on the basic model of one religion in one territory, in spite of the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of religion. Following the second phase of the revival movement, the so-called classical free churches emerged in Germany. The Baptists were confronted from the beginning with state reprisals like seizure, arrest, police interrogation, prohibition of assembly. Ostracized by society, restricted by the state church and the authorities, the Baptist and other free churches demanded state tolerance and civil rights. Various free churches achieved only with difficulty a certain amount of state recognition in the second half of the 19th century, which never reached the status of equality with the two main churches. The state toleration was reached by means of their neutral stance in political events, such as the revolutionary years around 1848. So as not to endanger their missionary endeavors and the work of the church, they came to the conviction that it was better to keep out of politics. This must be held as an important hallmark of the German free churches, of which the German Baptists are one. In their struggle for recognition in the society, the German Baptists thus modified their basic principle of separation of church and state to a requirement of absolute neutrality in political affairs. With regard to Western rights of liberty, they asked for more tolerance and state connivance in the exercise of their church life. This separation of church and state meant for the Baptists, above all, freedom from state interference in church life and freedom in their missionary efforts. The positive or pro-church relationship between church and state, which existed in the USA, was not intended. The possibility of acceptance of social responsibilities, which could nevertheless be in keeping with the separation of church and state, was never recognized by the German Baptist in the same measure as by the Anglo-American churches. Religious pluralism and secular democracy cannot be seen as founding values of the German Baptists. The separation of church and state meant for the Baptists, moreover, the salvation historical isolation from the world. On account of the political and church political situation, they lived first as a defamed sect, then as a conditionally recognized religious community on the edges of society, as separated in an exclusive sense. Not the renewal of society, but the separation and exodus of the company of true believers who constantly lived in the biblical ideal, developed in the free church ideal. The voluntary, self-financing and self-governing church became thus the basic definition of separation. Because of the repressive situation, they no longer demanded freedom of faith and conscience as a basic right for everybody. Instead, they stood for state tolerance and permission to undertake missionary work for their own denomination. In addition, they tried to secure state recognition and a few privileges by means of political neutrality and demonstrative loyalty. That was the situation of the German free churches in the 20th century, which, after a short period of democracy, confronted them with the demands of total control under the ideological dictatorships. On account of their faithfulness to the monarchy, the German Baptists had an ambivalent relationship to the Weimar Republic, the first German democracy. At first, they put great hope in the new form of government because for the first time, the constitution guaranteed the free church demand for the separation of church and state. Because the political aims could not be realized, disappointment grew in the Baptist churches. Only a few saw real chances in the democratic form of government. Some of the leaders desired taking on political responsibility through their participation in one of the conservative Christian parties, for example in the Christlich-Sozialen Volksdienst. This party was a decided opponent of the growing National Socialist movement. In contrast to the political involvement of the few, most Baptists were apolitical. Apolitical behavior was propagated in the Baptist publications and was understood to be a genuine free church value. Politics were a private affair, and party political neutrality had to be upheld. The Baptists were, like the two main churches, nothing more than correct partners of the new government, and there remained nothing more than an ineradicable mistrust of the ideological neutral state without God. This accommodation with the interest of the state since its inception and the difficult acquisition of privileges which safeguarded its being made their stamp on the Baptist Union. Its historical experiences, where political abstinence and demonstrative loyalty to the state were the best guarantees for tolerance from the state, determined its relationship to the changing authorities. Thus, they didn't recognize the democratic powers as their true partners for achieving their rights. Many joined the Nazi propaganda's bitter criticism of the Weimar Republic. In summary, one has to come to the result that the German Baptists found greater acceptance for a Christian authoritarian state which allowed their denominational liberties than for the ideological neutral democracy which guaranteed the separation of church and state. In addition to the political and economic crisis during the last phase of the Weimar Republic, there arose an internal crisis in Baptist circles in which they deliberated about the identity of the Union and its significance in the changing state of society. The constitution of the Union was reformed along democratic lines. However, this was felt by many church members to be too formal and paralyzing. Like many other Germans, the Baptists held the danger of a communist takeover for real. The oppressive communist rule in the UdSSR was perceived as a real threat. Baptist anti-communism was strengthened through the close links with the Russian churches in the Soviet Union, which had to endure state repression. At the end of the Weimar Republic, the German Baptists had found no uniform position in the debate about National Socialism. The opinion ranged from sharp rejection to active membership in the NSDAP. The escalating struggle between the antagonizing political movements manifested itself in the churches as well. This brought the leaders of the Union to issue a warning to the churches to prevent every sort of agitation for a political party, wearing of party badges and greeting with party slogans. The political neutrality of the churches was emphasized. In addition, there arose an apocalyptic interpretation of the turbulent events. The majority of the Baptists were from the outset politically disinterested. They wanted the church to remain a quiet island of peace in the middle of the political debate. In the first year after the so-called seizure of power on the 30th January 1933, Hitler and his party succeeded within a few months in destroying the whole democratic system of law and order in Germany. Through the means of forcing everyone into line, as it called in German, Gleichschaltung, the jurisdiction of the state parliaments was withheld, the existing parties were dissolved, and all other democratic institutions like the trade unions were destroyed. The administration of justice was robbed of its democratic foundation. Authoritative for the jurisdiction was popular sentiment, the so-called Volksempfinden, and Nazi ideology. A hierarchically organized one-party dictatorship under the Führer Adolf Hitler arose, which was empowered with all the powers of the state. These were specifically implemented against political and ideological opponents. This so-called national revolution was greeted and supported by the vast majority of German people. I do not wish to go into the grounds of this enthusiastic assent and refer you to the relevant literature. It is important to understand the huge dynamic of this political upheaval, which was understood by the Christian as a God-given turn of events. You can see a very famous picture here. This is the so-called Day of Potsdam, and you see almost a Holy Trinity. The Prussian king, Frederick the Great, the old Reichs-Chancellor or Reichs-President Hindenburg, he was a hero from the First World War, and then in the front Hitler. And in the back you can see a very famous cathedral in Potsdam. And you see the line, the historical line between Prussia, the Christian faith and heritage, and Hitler. And this was a postcard from this day, and Hitler in the first months of his dictatorship, he really wants to convince the whole German people and the Christians that he is very fond of Christian beliefs and traditions. The German Baptists were also carried along with a wave of enthusiasm for the new leadership. After the decisive parliamentary vote of the 5th March of 1933, this was regarded as a legitimate government which according to Romans 13 was to be owed obedience. From the beginning, however, the Baptists saw their organizational continuity and later on the very existence of the Union as endangered through the totalitarian state. This insecurity was a result of the self-contradictory church politics of the Nazi leadership. Hitler looked on the churches only as a factor for promulgating or for hindering his scheme of unifying the nation. The party political program of the NSDAP contained, on tactical grounds, an ambivalent and enigmatic confession to, I quote, positive Christianity, which many Christians interpreted as general openness for Christian values. The Nazi leadership aimed at forcing the two main churches into complete conformity. Where the Catholic Church had been seemingly integrated into the revolutionary state through the conclusion of the Reichskonkordat in July 1933 and the accompanying destruction of the political Catholicism, the 38 Protestant state churches were to be brought together in a process of ideological conquest from the inside to a unified, centrally led Reichschurch under the leadership of a single bishop. In order to secure total power, Hitler was at first ready to enter into a tactical approachment with the churches, which required a positive attitude on the part of the churches to the Nazi regime. I would like to show you a picture of the signing of the Reichskonkordat, and this was the election of the Reichsbishop Müller. This was the tactical rapprochement of Hitler to the main churches. After the controversial election of the Reichsbishop, the German church struggle between church and state flared up. This was the birth of the confessional church, the so-called Bekennende Kirche, among whose number were counted the famous theologian Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. What stance did the German Baptists take? While the two main churches were negotiating with the state authorities in 1933, through which the building of the Protestant Reichschurch was begun, and on the other hand the Catholic Church was put into place by the Reichskonkordat, the free churches fell into a difficult situation. Through the nationalist faith movement of German Christians, the dissolution of the free churches and their integration into the Protestant Reichschurch was propagated. Simultaneously, the worry arose in Baptist circles that they could be accused of being not of German but of foreign origin and could meet with difficulties because of their international links. It was demanded in public lectures that the Baptists, together with all other sects, should no longer belong in Germany but in Africa. It did not stop with this demand. In the process of church reform in the Rhine era and in Westphalia, some Baptist churches were actually disbanded and integrated into the Protestant Lutheran Church. The leaders of the Baptist Union drew two organizational consequences from this state of affairs. In order to avoid being forcibly integrated in the Lutheran Reichschurch, they sought to merge with other free churches to form a German free church, which should exist alongside the other two main churches. In addition to this, they undertook to reorganize the union according to the example of the state on a hierarchical and centralist basis through the introduction of the so-called Führer principle. These two strategies determined the year 1933 and were formed by disputes of area of responsibilities in position in the state and in the churches, whose responsibilities for the free churches had not been made clear. The reconstruction of a congregationalist union of independent churches, whose highest body was an administration elected by union delegates, into a hierarchically organized church under the authoritarian leadership of a union Führer was like the squaring of the circle. Nevertheless, the church delegates of the Union Conference of 1933 agreed to the introduction of the Führer principle, but only after heated discussion and on account of the special political circumstances. The only concession to the objections of the delegates was the election of 3 instead of 1 Union Führer. The rigorous attempt of these 3 to enforce the Führer principle on the regional and congregational level led to open resistance in the local churches. One joined in free meetings in order to protest against authoritarian union leadership. The churches did not tolerate the unions making up their minds for them. They regarded this as a breaking with the free church traditions. One of these meetings took place in the town of Wuppertal-Barmen, which was so important for the German church struggle, in which the first synod of the confessional church would take place 1 year later. Here you can see once again the organizational consequences to the formation of a united German free church and the introduction of the Führerprinzip in the Union. But the Führer principle failed in the first months to gain foot in the Baptist Union and was unable to be enforced. As the Union Congresses only took place every 3 years, it could first be removed from the status in 1936. At the end of 1933, the German free churches were assured from the Lutheran churches that they would not be integrated into the German Protestant Reichschurch. After this assurance came, the plan for building a unified German free church was immediately discarded. The attempts to unify the free churches entered into a new phase in 1937, as the anti-church line of the Nazi regime and its rigid line against the sects became more obvious, resulting in the banning of smaller religious organizations. At the end of 1933, after a period of infighting within the church and church political anxieties, the Baptists had wrung themselves through to a position of absolute affirmation of the state, shown in their publications and in their strict obedience to every order from the state. The then General Secretary of the Baptist World Alliance, James Henry Rushbrook, reported on his homecoming from a visit to Germany, I quote, "The overwhelming majority of German Baptists welcome the Nazi government with the chancellorship of Herr Hitler, chiefly on the ground that it has averted the peril of atheist communist domination." A painful intervention of the Nazi state hit the youth work of the German Baptists in February 1934. The enforced integration of the Protestant youth organization in the National Socialist Youth Organization, the so-called Hitlerjugend, through the contract between the Reichsbischof and the leader of the Hitler Youth, Baldur von Schirach, had indirect consequences for the Baptist youth work. In order to avoid being forced to conform, and therefore delivering the whole youth to the Hitler Youth, the youth union dissolved itself. The youth work went over into the responsibility of the local church. This was closely observed by the state, so that the latter could be certain that it was just a matter of purely religious activities, that there would not be a competition alongside the Nazi youth organization. At this point in time, the Nazi state had no interest in the free churches at all, so that these could continue their Christian work and mission unhindered. This situation first changed when their propaganda potential with regard to the international Baptist community was discovered and was used as a tool against the Protestant Lutheran Church, which was struggling for its independence. The year 1934 was marked by the struggle of the Lutheran churches to restrain their independence from the totalitarian state. Although there was a measure of sympathy in the Baptist churches for the confessional church, the union leadership distanced itself officially from the struggle and obliged the local churches to take a neutral course of action. The problematic earlier relationship between the Lutheran state church and the free churches hindered their alliance in the face of the Nazi regime. The struggle between church and state was perceived by the Baptists to be a chance to remain untouched. But from the confessional church side, there was no signal of readiness to hold talks or of cooperation. The deliberate decision by the confessional church to assume a so-called volkskirchliche structure led to the free churches turning away, disappointed, where they emphasized their own neutrality in the struggle between church and state and established in a self-sufficient manner that they had managed to avoid a similar crisis. The neutral course with regard to the struggle between church and state was constantly held to after 1934, reaching up till the serious turn of events at the World Council of Churches in Oxford in 1937, at which free church representatives distanced themselves publicly from the confessional church. The celebration of 100 years of continental Baptist churches, which were visited by state representatives, led the Baptists into the limelight of the media for the first time. In contrast to the Protestant Lutheran churches, which were at that time part of the struggle between church and state, the Baptists were distinguished by the Nazi rulers as being an exemplary religious grouping. This up till now unknown esteem by the state led to the church's strong approval of the Nazi regime. The planning, inviting and carrying through of the Baptist World Alliance Congress in Berlin 1934 belongs equally in this context of their being used by the state. The German Baptists had in the spring of 1933 originally cancelled the Congress so as not to endanger the integration of the churches in the new national state through their obvious links with churches abroad. Then, pressure from the German government offices resulted in the Congress being re-invited, promoted and used as a propaganda measure against the skeptics abroad, and was held in Berlin in 1934. From the outset, the German Baptists found themselves in conflict between state and denominational interests. The unclear legal situation of the Baptists in the Third Reich and the attempt to secure the existence of the Baptist Union strengthened their readiness to conform to the condition and demands of the state. At the same time, the Congress put the German Baptists through a severe test. as the sister churches abroad were thoroughly critical of the Nazi state, above all with regard to its race ideology. The responsible people of the German Union guaranteed to the state authority the politically harmless run of events at the Congress, although the main topics, racism, nationalism, and the question of peace, were all potentially explosive. The German Baptists found themselves from the beginning in the defensive, which expressed itself in oath of loyalty to the Nazi state. Nevertheless, the Baptist World Alliance Congress was an extraordinary event in which, perhaps for the last time during the Third Reich, the dangers of nationalism, racism, and militarism were spoken of in front of an international body without intervention from the state. A commission of the World Union had tackled the theme of nationalism since 1931. It became convinced that nationalism was one of the main causes of war, which was the reason that the churches had no right to remain passive and neutral in the face of chauvinist nationalism. The nationalists postulate that the state had an absolute and unrestricted claim to power was condemned because it inevitably led to the loss of freedom among the population and to enmity among the peoples. These remarks hit the center of the Nazi ideology of the state. The resolution expressed significant verdicts against nationalism, but also against racism and anti-Semitism. The Baptist World Alliance Congress took a clear position against all forms of racial discrimination in the very capital of the country, which had created a special jurisdiction for its Jewish citizens, in which these were defamed, deprived of their rights, and persecuted. The German Baptists felt themselves called to defend the Nazi politics, but also supported the clear resolutions in all topics. During the visit of a high-ranking delegation of the Baptist World Alliance to the Reichsbischof, the Baptists were received written assurance that they would not be forcefully included in the Reichschurch, which was coming into being. The Baptist World Alliance Congress was celebrated by the state as a great propaganda success. The large public interest in the event and the resulting echo in the press led to the Baptists gaining a lot of prestige. In the Nazi publications, the Baptists were even portrayed as being an exemplary religious body and were recommended to the two main churches as worthy of emulation. One important aim had been achieved through the decided appearance of the numerically imposing sister churches, the free existence of the Baptists. The period following the first 2 years of the dictatorship, which was a time of toleration, must be regarded as a steep contrast. The Union of Baptist Churches could not succeed in securing its legal position throughout the land as a public body or corporation in spite of many negotiations, in contrast to other free churches. From the beginning of 1935, the state had begun to use systematic surveillance measures which led to the banning of some smaller religious bodies. Through the luring of member lists, the political thinking of the group was evaluated, whereby neutrality and political existence counted as negative criteria. This judgment seems unusual, but is typical for an ideological dictatorship. The conscious apolitical nature of a church is not appreciated, but is criticized as an immunizing strategy against the ideological saturation of the society. The Baptist took a hard, critical argument over at the nationalistic racist movement called Völkische Bewegung, which a state propaganda wave had started in 1935. The Baptist Church proved themselves to be quite resistant against the new pagan thought. They failed to recognize the close connection between the Nazi leadership and the national movement's völkische ideology. The open enmity against Christianity, which appears first in the ideological struggle in 1935, the police interference in Baptist missionary work, and the state surveillance measures led to a basic rethinking about the way ahead of the German Baptist. The arrest of a well-known preacher and leader of the Union because of his critical remarks about the nationalistic ideology triggered off a recommendation to the churches that they pull out of the public debate. The churches were to hold themselves apart from any dispute about the state ideology. This retreat into inwardness, together with political good behavior, characterized the route taken by the German Baptists until the end of the war. The toleration of the Baptist missionary work enabled an arrangement with the Nazi state, whose anti-church character and totalitarian claim to power were increasingly recognized. Speculations about the last days were an escape route for many Baptists for survival in these critical days. 1937 saw the climax of the ban on the sects. The anti-church fraction in the NSDAP, which aimed at decentralizing and finally liquidating the churches, won increasing amounts of power. As a result of this dangerous development for the free churches, this took up again the thought of unifying the German free churches, which had already been discussed in 1933. Through the merging of the free churches, they desired to gain more relevance opposite the totalitarian state. The attempt to merge the free churches ran into great difficulties, and in the coming years there was little success to be seen. In the middle of the negotiations came the surprising news of the banning of the Brethren churches. They were later authorized to constitute themselves as the Union of Free Brethren churches under strict condition imposed by the state authorities, of which demonstrative loyalty to the National Socialism was one. In my opinion, this was a singular event in the sect politics of the Nazis. In the following years, the Baptists took in repeatedly religious groups which were about to be banned, in order to bolster their own numbers and to support their own existence. At the same time, they sought to secure the standing of the Baptist churches through demonstrative loyalty to the state and through good contacts with various state authorities, above all with the Reichsministry of Churches. The basic loyalty to the state was not in question. In addition came the apolitical stance in the churches, the simultaneous concentration on missionary work, which was tolerated by the state. Just some information about the relationship to the Jewish policy. One can only speak about a discussion in the Baptist churches about the Jewish question during the first phase of the Nazi dictatorship. As publication from 1933 shows us, in the face of state persecution of the Jewish population, the Baptists behaved passively throughout. With regard to the few Jewish members in the Baptist churches, they dispensed with the general ruling. The so-called non-Arian laws were not put into practice in the churches, so that Jewish members were not shut out of the membership, and in the case of their moving house were also taken into membership of the church. Nevertheless, the Jewish members had to endure a certain amount of discrimination in the churches. Involved help from a few individuals stood opposite isolation through the majority of church members. Looking back, it is particularly shameful that in connection with the Reichspogrom night in November 1938, the German Union looked into the possibility of buying up synagogues cheaply. After the pogrom, it was advised against buying synagogues because former Jewish prayer houses, which had been bought up by the Baptists, had already been demolished and burned down. Attempts were made to reduce the material losses for the Baptist churches by suing for repayment of the purchase price. The last phase of the persecution of the Jews was closed in silence by the Baptists. Some individuals gave their help to the conquered regions in the east and tried to reduce the great suffering. Hitler's expansion politics and his successes in foreign policy, like the annexation of Austria, were joyfully greeted by the Baptists as by the vast majority of the German population. They saw the chance of reaching new mission fields. This mission-oriented commentary developed into a stereotyped reception of the foreign successes of the Nazi state. At the outbreak of the Second World War, loyalty to the fatherland was considered by the Baptist churches to be an undisputed duty to be taken for granted. To this day, there is only one known case of refusal to undertake military service by a Baptist. Alfred Herbst, member of the Stuttgart Baptist Church, became a conscientious objector and was hanged in 1943 for subversion of the armed forces. The anti-church methods of the Nazi rulers, which came under the cloak of war necessities, interfered massively in church affairs and led to renewed negotiation about a merger of the free churches. In autumn 1940, they expected a decisive turn of events in favor of Germany and desired to ward off an enforced reorganization of the churches after the war through their own initiative. Thus, the leading bodies of the Baptist and Brethren churches forced a speedy merger, which was adopted in February of 1941, but was sanctioned by the state only after a painful period of waiting in October 1942. That this was no way of intentional ecumenical consensus, but was instead a contemporarily motivated emergency fellowship, is shown by the actual development in the post-war period. The organizational merger of the two rather different free churches gave itself the still valid name Union of Evangelical Free Churches. The neutral name of the denomination was intentional. They wanted to remain open for the entry of further free churches. The duration of the war brought more and more serious state reprisals, which strengthens the anxiety about the existence of the church. In addition, there arose grave material losses. The Preachers' Seminary in Hamburg, the Union headquarters, and several church buildings were destroyed. Half of the preachers had been called up. From 1943, the coming defeat was ever more recognized by the leadership in the Union, and they began to take preventive measures for the post-war period. In spite of this assessment, the free churches sent a congratulatory telegram to prove their unbroken loyalty to the Führer after the failed attempt on his life on the 20th of July 1944. The Second World War brought great losses for the new church union. Around 145 churches with 407 branch churches were lost through the transfer of the German territories in the east. A third of the members had become refugees. Almost all the important institutions of the Union were destroyed or extensively damaged. In the post-war period, the traditional tendency to separate from the state and to concentrate on missionary work continued. The theologically legitimized distance between the churches and society was even enlarged in terms of political and ethical responsibility. Let me come to the end. During the Nazi period, the separation principle was increasingly given up on tactical grounds by the leader of the Union of Baptist Churches. This tragedy even led to a temporary assumption of state forms for the organization of the churches, as the introduction of the Führer principle on the Union on 1933 till 1936 shows us. The ubiquitous influence of the total state on the decision-making of the churches and the Union can be continually proven from the sources. Where the Baptists in the early period of the Nazi dictatorship seem as a welcome propaganda tool for foreign purposes and on occasion in the framework of church-state policies as a means of discrimination in the struggle against the confessional church, the participants could nevertheless be in no doubt about the fact that this privileged treatment would only be a temporary toleration. The Baptist decision-makers developed a policy of diplomatic maneuvering with the state authorities in order not to endanger the life of the churches with the background of the very repressive policy on sects of the Nazi state after the year 1937. Due to fears about their existence and in order to meet the ever-present threat of a ban, the representatives of the Union accommodated themselves readily to the state demands. As a result, the Baptists concentrated themselves almost exclusively during the Nazi period on their missionary work and the strengthening of the churches. In this, the traditional interpretation of separation of church and state was modified to being consistently apolitical. In the shadow of the great ecclesiastical struggles, the German Baptists tried to stabilize their legal status and to maintain as far as possible their autonomy. In the struggle to survive, the climate between the churches was characterized more and more by animosity, differences and prejudice. In face of the German church struggle, they behaved neutrally or distanced themselves publicly from the confessional church, as happened on the World Churches Conference in 1937 in Oxford. The Baptist leading body even accepted the resulting ecumenical isolation in order to secure their institutional and organizational inactness. The extreme situation as a minority and the consciousness of their numerical meaninglessness led to, on the other hand, in the various phases of the Third Reich, to an intensive search for a merging of all German free churches as to gain at least some relevance opposite the total state. Out of these fears for their existence and from their continual acceptance of the demands of the state, the free churches became a stabilizing factor of the Nazi dictatorship. So I want to come to the end and I'm not quite sure if you want me to present the declaration of guilt to you. Perhaps we just come to the end now?
Say more about that, please.
Yes. This is a declaration of guilt from the year 1984. As you can see, 40 years later, and it took a long way and a difficult process to formulate and to present this declaration of guilt to the international body of the European Baptist Federation at the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the Baptist Union in Germany. And for me, I was a young student of theology then. It was really a moving and emotional moment to hear this declaration of guilt in front of the former enemies and the former I would say, brethren who saw and know all these failures from the Baptist Union in Germany. It's quite unusual to have such a declaration such a long time after the dictatorship, but perhaps you are interested in listening to the words? Yes. Shall I read it or would you? Okay. So I take it. A survey. Oh. Whoops. A survey of the 150 years of history of the Baptists in Germany includes the turmoil of the period under National Socialist domination. Both among and through our people, much injustice was done. We are filled with shame and grief, particularly when we recall the persecution and mass extermination of the Jews. Because of this, our national guilt, we are dependent upon the forgiveness of God. Instigated by Germany, the Second World War brought immeasurable suffering to many and ended in a horrifying catastrophe. To this day, we and to an even greater degree the peoples of other countries must bear the consequences. To recognize the evil from the beginning was more difficult than it seems in retrospect today. There were those among us who saw through the then regime, warned against it, and bravely opposed the injustice. But we did not ally ourselves openly with the struggles and suffering of the confessional church, and likewise failed to set ourselves unequivocally against the violation of the divine commandment and precepts. It weighs heavily upon us that we, as the German Federation, often succumbed to the ideological temptations of the time and did not show greater courage in professing truth and justice. Even after the collapse of the Hitler regime, it was only individuals and not officially in the Union of Evangelical Free Church Congregation who voiced an opinion on these events. As those who lived through the period only in part or not at all, we see ourselves involved in and sharing the guilt of our people and of our community. We acknowledge this today before you, our brothers and sisters of the European Baptist Federation. We pray to God that we have learned from this chapter of our history that we must be more vigilant in pursuing the spiritual temptations of our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Doctor. This has been a very poignant lecture, and I'm sure you have questions or comments, and I will let our lecturer respond to the questions herself. So please, questions, comments?
How widely known is the subject matter which you have just exposed for us? how widely accepted or understood in Germany?
Actually, I did the first academic or scientific approach to this time. It was really a taboo for many generations, and when I began with my research, I had to get through many struggles, and to get open to the source. It was really a difficult way for me. I had quite a bit of advantage because my father was the former president of the union, so they opened the sources to me after his invention. And though my book was the first one about the history of the free churches in the Third Reich.
How was it received by reviewers?
I have a second edition, and the second edition is sold out. As you can see, that this was really appreciated by the audience in the congregation, but also in the scientific community.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the other free churches, like the Methodists and the Mennonites and the free evangelical churches, started to approach this phase of their history only in the 80s of the 20th century. You see, there was a very long time of not recognition this phase of history, of church history. Mm.
Just to make an idea, to what percentage would you appreciate a Baptist now in Germany? How many Baptists?
Oh, yes, we are a very small minority church. You can see during the Nazi dictatorship, there were 120,000 Baptists, and now we have 85 million people in Germany and only 80,000 Baptists. All of the free churches together are only 1% of the population. We have 1/3 Catholic, Roman Catholic, 1/3 in the territorial Protestant churches, and 1/3 not a member of a religious body. Mm-hmm.
I have one more question.
Okay.
So, if I understood well, the free church encountered opposition straight from the beginning.
Yes.
How do you explain this in a Germany that already saw a Reformation?
Because the Reformation and the Reformation era and the confessionalist era formed a typical relationship between state and church, especially in the Protestant territories. You see that there is a very close relationship between state and church. And the separation of church and state was established only in 1980, after the First World War. So there is a long tradition of state church. And as I said in my paper, as I presented to you, since the Westphalia Peace Treaty in 1648, there was some kind of tradition to say that in one territory there might be only one religion, one territory, one religion, and there was no looking for some kind of pluralism, or to be sympathetic for pluralism, religious pluralism. Only since the phase of enlightenment, there's some kind of census for religious freedom and tolerance. But I think there's a big difference between the principle of tolerance and the principle of religious freedom as a basic right. Tolerance can be thrown away,